Hong Kong, a city of 7 million, a global financial hub. Outside government headquarters, several thousand students are standing in the middle of a major highway. Moments later, they are greeted by tear gas from the police. They are blinded, their skin burns, people scream. Little do they know that this action would cause thousands to join a month-long occupation of the streets. A battle between students, police, the government, and organised crime.
They call their movement Occupy Central with Love and Peace.
Riot police fired volleys of tear gas at pro-democracy demonstrators.
We're not just making news, we are recording history.
You should have seen the TV footage of a number police officer brutally assaulting me.
With some wondering whether Hong Kong is on the brink of its own Tiananmen Square uprising.
In 1941, the British Empire conquered a small fishing village which would be known as Hong Kong. Over the next 150 years, it would be turned into a financial Goliath for world trade. However, the region wouldn't remain under British control forever. There was an agreement that the island would be handed back to China after 100 years. An agreement the British were unlikely to keep, but the empire was no more, and China was gaining more power on the world stage. Eventually, everyone's favourite Prime Minister signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which formalised the handover of the territory back to China. She fell on the stairs on her way out. From this point forward, the region would be officially under China control. However, not entirely. In all the time under colonial rule, the territory had developed a unique identity to the mainland. They have their own language, their own currency, and a free press. Not to mention it had a capitalist system, unlike the communist one in the mainland. The initial confusion of joining with China was met with widespread disdain towards the idea, with the majority of people wanting to remain as a British colony. However, after the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed, they quickly changed their tunes. Within the agreement were promises that the territory would have a high degree of autonomy. This was fantastic as people were obsessed with the idea of Hong Kongers running Hong Kong, which is something that did not happen under the colonial administration. They would finally have independence and a say in their government. Meanwhile, they could become closer to their Chinese cousins just across the border. There was a general sense of excitement about the transition. That is until 1989. After the death of General Secretary Hu Yaobang, thousands of students took to Tiananmen Square to mourn his death. He was a symbol of anti-corruption and political reform. Eventually, the mourning turned into a protest against the central government. Many wanted free press and less corruption. For nearly 2 months, the protests expanded. It became an international embarrassment when Gorbachev made a visit to the city. Originally planned to meet at Tiananmen Square, this had to be cancelled due to 3,000 people hunger striking in the area. Even getting through the city was a slog, as protesters would harass his procession at every single turn. A further embarrassment started when the government announced martial law and brought in the army. However, they were immediately surrounded by protesters. They only managed to escape the city 3 days later. This was the final straw for the government. A week later, they brought in the army again. This time, they resorted to using their guns. Protesters were shot with their backs turned. Officially, 241 were killed, which on its own is a staggering number, but many outside sources have placed the number far, far higher. So look at it from this perspective. You are a Hong Konger watching the country that you're about to join mow down civilians. This would cause a little bit of alarm. In fact, it caused a massive amount of concern. A quarter of the territory's entire population took to the streets to join a protest in support of the students. A number so great it paralleled the size of the movement in Beijing 1,000 miles away. Approval rating for joining the mainland dropped to 21%, when they had been much higher at 79%. This had a significant impact on those in the territory, so much that it encouraged the development of an identity separate from China. By the time the region was handed back to the mainland, 45% of the population viewed themselves as Hong Kongers rather than Chinese. From this point forward, every year the region would hold a ceremony on the 4th of June to commemorate those who died in the event, receiving tens of thousands of participants each year. Which had a certain level of irony, as by joining back with China, Hong Kong became the only part of the mainland where it is legal to openly talk about Tiananmen Square. But this also shows why many people wanted further democracy so they could retain some independence from Beijing. Whilst the democratic movement existed beforehand, this event set in stone the modern democracy movement that would permeate the region for the next 30 years. So let's introduce a method for tracking democracy. This is a pair of weighing scales. On the left is the establishment and on the right is the independence. Factors that encourage Hong Kong to join with China will raise the left, whilst factors that allow for Hong Kong to gain democracy will raise the right. It's important to know that total independence is not what I mean. This is seen as an extremist view within the region. Instead, it's independence to make decisions without Chinese interference. Hong Kongers running Hong Kong. In fact, Beijing had a term for this. One country, two systems. After Tiananmen Square, the scales would have looked like this. As a result, there was a desire for the colonial government to pursue new reforms to democratize the territory before China came into power. The region's government was split into two parts: the executive branch and the legislative branch, also known as LegCo. Both sections before the joint declaration were very unrepresentative. In fact, the only reason Britain was even willing to pursue democracy in the region was so they could maintain Western influence in the area. They after all wanted to maintain control of the territory, but alas they couldn't. So there was a scramble to rapidly democratize the area. In this regard, there was a joint desire to achieve democracy. Democrats wanted it so that he gained more independence, whilst Britain hoped it could hold on to some economic and political influence. The executive branch would be run by a hand-picked governor all the way until the handover. However, there were changes to the legislative branch, making the lawmaking process more democratic. In 1991, some of the seats of LegCo were voted in publicly for the first time. And in 1995 there was a colossal change, as a whopping 2.6 million were given the vote. This was astronomical for the democracy movement in the territory. And this was all in time for Hong Kong's transfer over to China.
Hong Kong and Chinese flags being raised to the sound of the national anthem to mark the 6th anniversary of the territory's return to China.
Now that Britain was out and Beijing was in, it was time for a few changes. First of all, the Legislative Council that was originally intended to remain in place throughout the handover process to ensure stability and generally lead to a sense of continuity between the two regimes was removed. Instead, a hand-picked pro-Beijing government was instituted. Their first move was to change the electoral system, shrinking the 2.6 million electorate to 230,000. This was a big hit towards the democracy movement. The reason for this? In the joint declaration there was a line about current institutions must remain unchanged for 50 years. Although Britain took this to mean current as in after the handover, whereas China assumed this to be from the perspective of when the document was signed, before all the democratic changes had been made. The agreement was left deliberately vague in many places and neither side could agree on the specifics, and this is one of those vague points. So when Britain changed the electoral system to have 2.6 million, it destroyed the discussions between the two nations. In response, China saw the current legislature as illegitimate, so they removed them and changed the law. A blow to Hong Kong independence. On the positive though, they introduced democracy to the executive branch, now run by an elected chief executive instead of a hand-picked governor. Well, kind of. But to explain that, we'll have to move forward in time. Over the years there had been several key issues with the one country, two systems debate, such as the 2003 protests which saw 256,000 marched against a national security law which would allow you to be arrested for vague reasons.
Nearby as demonstrators tried to disrupt the event. They were protesting against controversial new legislation that many fear will undermine freedom of speech, press and assembly.
The outlash was so large that it caused the bill to be gutted and the chief executive to step down. Or in 2012, where Joshua Wong, a 14-year-old boy, started a campaign to protest a new school curriculum that was supposed to teach Chinese patriotic values.
Let the people choose their own government.
Despite being Hong Kong kids, we and our parents were not consulted. We don't know much about it.
100,000 joined his protest outside of government headquarters, causing the new curriculum to be binned.
In the face of the continuing protests, Hong Kong's chief executive, C.Y. Leung, who only took office in July, eventually backed down, blaming the crisis on his predecessor's efforts to introduce the controversial curriculum.
Even in between these events, each year there were thousands participating in pro-democracy rallies. All of this was happening in the pursuit of universal suffrage. Universal suffrage means one person, one vote. This is pretty much as democratic as you can get, and this was deeply wanted because the current electoral system is not ideal to say the least. Both the chief executive and legislative council don't exactly meet this standard. So for the chief executive election, the general public doesn't directly vote in their candidate. Instead, people vote for one of the members of the 1,200 electoral committee. And it's this group that chooses the leader of the region. Now, if the system remained like this, it wouldn't be too dissimilar to the first past the post system found in the US or UK. However, it's more complicated than this. To be able to vote for one of the members of the electoral committee, you have to be one of the 250,000 members of the subsectors. There's a bunch of them from financial, tourism, education, and agricultural. However, just because you work for one of these areas doesn't mean you get to vote in the election. In some sectors, you do, such as the education sector, where 84,000 get to participate, but in others like finance, only 125 get to. Meanwhile, those 84,000 people vote in 30 members of the electoral committee, whereas those mere 125 votes vote in 18. Therefore, this means congratulations if you work in the financial district, as your vote is worth 400 times more than a vote in the education district. For this model, I've skewed the proportions to make it easier to understand, but if you want the real structure, here it is. Hong Kong, a city of 7 million, with 3.5 million potential voters, of which only 250,000 can vote for 1,200 people who vote for their leader. Not to mention that some of the votes are worth far more than others. If that sounds bad, it's because it is. Not only is it unrepresentative, but it's biased. Now, for the subsector section, I've said people vote in this. However, in reality, it's a mix of people and companies that get a vote. The fact businesses joining causes a long list of issues, but the most significant one is that it disproportionately gives power to pro-Beijing groups. Large organizations in Hong Kong do a significant amount of trade with China, so it benefits them to vote in favor of the CCP. Additionally, the subsectors themselves are set up in a way to advantage the mainland. Subsectors such as finance, tourism, and industrial all benefit from integrating with China. One of them is even called Chinese medicine. I wonder who they'll vote for. Needless to say, this system is not ideal. It means that the opinions of the mainland are overrepresented in the local government, which removes power from those who live in the territory. To sum up, the chief executive election process is a complicated mess. Thankfully, the LegCo election is far more simplistic. In 2012, the Legislative Council had 70 seats, and they were split 50-50. On the left you had 35 geographical constituency seats, and on the right you had 35 functional constituency seats. Geographical seats are directly voted in by the people, whereas functional seats are voted in by businesses and entities. They operate in a very similar way to the subsectors from the chief executive election. It's the same premise really. Straight off the bat, the Legislative Council is a lot more representative of the people, because it includes those geographical places. When the most recent changes were made to LegCo, the Democrats even sneakily modified 5 of those functional seats, so in reality, they operated more like geographical ones. Therefore, in the 2012 Legislative Council election, most Hong Kongers had 2 votes. one for a geographical place and one for a functional. This in turn made this the most democratic Lakeko election since the 1995 one just before the handover. So it took about 15 years for Beijing to implement a policy that already existed. In addition to this, Lakeko has rules to prevent either the geographical or functional side of the chamber from controlling legislation. When a lawmaker is proposing a law, they must get a majority from both the geographical side and the functional side for the law to be approved. This is actually a clever way to ensure a balance between their economic decisions and social decisions. Additionally, it reduces bias in the battle between the pro-democracy and pro-establishment side. Functional constituencies suffer from the same problem as the subsectors in the chief executive election, where they are significantly more pro-Beijing, whereas geographical seats tend to be split more 50-50. So even though the right side will always be in support of the mainland, it doesn't matter as the left side is far more contested. So in theory the legislature is far more equal than the executive, which in a way is a great thing as it is arguably more influential than the chief executive branch. Although even this is not the entire truth because of one factor. Lakeko members aren't the only people that can propose laws. So can the chief executive, and when they do it, they don't need a 50-50 split of both geographical and functional constituencies. They just need a simple majority of the entire chamber. And as we know, the executive side is always going to be biased towards the establishment. This poses a problem. When they enforce a law, the majority of the functional side and half the geographical side will vote in favour, ensuring any law the mainland wants in Hong Kong, they can get with a steep majority. So we know the chief executive will always be biased. There is significant bias in the Legislative Council. To make this even worse is that in order for any of this to be changed, the Hong Kong Constitution, the basic law, needs to be modified. In order for this to happen, the chief executive must make a report to the NPCSC asking for change. The NPCSC is an organisation run by Chinese bureaucrats. They will then decide whether there is a need for those changes and what can be changed, which is already off to a bad start. Then the bill must pass Lakeko with a 2/3 majority of the room, which I don't know if you've seen Lakeko recently, but that's not gonna happen. The functional seats would never willingly remove their own political power, and the pro-Beijing seats will always back, what's this? Oh yeah, Beijing! It doesn't help that the NPCSC has been abnormally slow in regards to electoral change. They were asked if in 2007, can the region have universal suffrage? They said no. For the 2012 election, they were asked again if they could have universal suffrage. They said no. However, they said that in 2017, they may be able to have it. May being the key word. If all of the democratic movement of the last few years has not been enough to gain universal suffrage, it was unlikely that in 2017, this would be any different. So we are left with a broken system. Hong Kongers have repeatedly been told the region isn't ready for universal suffrage by the mainland. All the electoral changes so far have been small and have not affected the status quo. There have been rallies and marches reaching hundreds of thousands to no avail. Even roads outside of government headquarters have been occupied by protesters, although none of this has led to universal suffrage. The democratic system in Hong Kong remains warped. So now, it's time for the nuclear option. Occupy Central with love and peace.